कभी तो आएगी।
अब भारत को देर नहीं करनी चाहिए, नेक्स्ट जनरेशन इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर पर बल देना होगा। रोड हो, रास्ते हो, रेल हो।
It is our duty to provide India with the physical infrastructure to enable this unprecedented movement of people and ideas. This infrastructure needs to connect India. It needs to connect Indian villages, it needs to connect Indian cities, and it needs to connect India to the rest of the world.
भारत सरकार में रेलवे का क्षेत्र इतना उदासीन रहा है। ज्यादा से ज्यादा एक ट्रेन इधर बढ़ा दो, एक ट्रेन उधर बढ़ा दो, 2 डिब्बे इधर डाल दो, 5 डिब्बे इधर डाल दो, उसी से आगे न रेल के लिए कोई सोच है।
To transport the material from the factory to the port is a big issue because of the infrastructure bottlenecks at the factory site or at the port.
The concept of master planning is probably almost non-existent. I think we tend to sort of decide in isolation. A concept of master planning needs to be brought, whether it is a city planning or whether it is highways planning.
Unless and until you have the infrastructure, the FDIs will not come to India, and if FDIs are not coming, your economy is not going to grow.
हिंदुस्तान का इतना बड़ा विशाल समुद्री तट है, वहां पर एक नई इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर की विधा खड़ी करके विश्व व्यापार में हम अपनी जगह क्यों न बना सके।
We need to have a better state-center coordination for large-scale infrastructure projects. We need to have risk mitigation parameters into place for the viability of the projects, and also we need to have accountability within the authorities and the government to make sure that the large infrastructure projects become viable.
सिर्फ सड़कों से, हवाई जहाजों से, रेलगाड़ियों से ये देश आगे नहीं जाएगा। ये देश जब आगे जाएगा जब जो लोग उन सड़कों को बनाते हैं, उन पुलों को बनाते हैं, उन रेलगाड़ियों को चलाते हैं, उनके पेट में जब तक खाना नहीं होगा, जब तक उनके पास दवाई नहीं होगी, तब तक ये देश आगे नहीं चलेगा।
वो सुबह आएगी।
Hello and welcome to Change India, an agenda for the next Prime Minister. Today in the 13th show of our series, we have 10 policy initiatives that will enable the next Prime Minister to eliminate India's seemingly perennial infrastructure deficit. Remember that we have already covered energy, urbanization and agriculture in earlier shows. Our suggestions have been culled from recommendations made by a group of experts, and you can get all the details from our website thinkindia.in.com. Joining us in the studio are 4 experts who know the sector inside out. We've got Mr. Vinayak Chatterjee, Chairman of Feedback Ventures, Mr. Sanjeev Aga, former CEO of Idea Cellular, Mr. Shailesh Pathak, a former IAS officer who is President of Shrey Infrastructure, and joining us on a satellite link from Bangalore is Mr. Srivatsa Krishna, an IAS officer with extensive experience in infrastructure, who is with us in his personal capacity. And with them is our very own Dheeraj Nair, CEO of Network 18's Think India Foundation, who has anchored this project for us. We also have an audience in the studio, among whom are some people who have actively pitched into the debate on Twitter and on our website. Do note that we will present our suggestions on infrastructure and 13 other policy areas to the next Prime Minister who takes office in June. So let's get on with our first 3 points, which we bunched together because we believe that the Prime Minister should be able to move very quickly on these, and in fact will probably have to move quickly on these in the very first couple of weeks in office. The first one is to create a national infrastructure board. Now, this is not a ceremonial thing we are saying. We are saying this requires the Prime Minister and the appropriate Chief Minister, the relevant Chief Minister, to be together in a board so that they can do quick clearances and bring focus. We also believe that the Union Environment Minister should be a member of this board, and for purposes of political symbolism, maybe the meetings of the board should be held in the state capitals in which the project is to be cited. Point number 2 is, this is an old one, you've got to cut down on the number of ministries, but farm out regulation to independent departmental undertakings or regulators who can set tariffs and the commercial terms. And we have said have it separately for key verticals. Number 3 is merge the ministries of roads and highways, railways, civil aviation and shipping into one ministry so that we can have a unified Ministry of Transport. That will be a difficult thing for the Prime Minister because 4 cabinet ministers will become one, and therefore he won't have so much of political largesse to dole out, but it's something that's very important. So these are points number 1, 2 and 3, and Vinayak, over to you.
This National Infrastructure Board is an idea that was first mooted by Mr. Chidambaram in November 2012 at the meeting of the, if I remember correctly, the National Development Council, which is the apex board which runs the Planning Commission, and the Prime Minister chairs it, and all chief ministers are present, NDC. The suggestion was a very powerful suggestion made by Mr. Chidambaram to clear the logjam, but it didn't take off. The NIB got converted into what is today called the CCI, the
but
Cabinet
that doesn't
Committee.
have the chief minister in it. So we are altering it a bit. We are not saying it's the NDC with every chief minister. We are saying if the project is in Orissa, then have the Orissa chief minister in that vertical.
I'm going to make an interesting comment. You know, Mr. Narendra Modi addressed an audience in Delhi. There he made an interesting point that the winning team for India is not going to be the new Prime Minister with 30 cabinet ministers, but the new Prime Minister with 29 chief ministers.
Right.
So in some senses, it's a different paradigm of development which says developmental should be pushed in an inclusive manner,
right,
not federal top-down,
right,
but in a federal structure.
Yeah.
So broadly, the thinking is in the right direction, and I'd endorse it.
Yeah. Mr. Aga. And if you could also address points number 2 and 3, which is also about the ministries.
Raghav, let me take your point number 2 first.
Yes.
Your point number 3, I would ignore, because the Prime Minister is going to be scared of 4 rent-seeking ministers, then
nothing will happen.
Then nothing will happen.
Yes.
But I would like to take on this point of separation of responsibility between policy and user charges, yes, and tariff setting.
Yes.
I will go much further. I would say that very much like the RBI or the SEBI, policy should be decided by the Union Cabinet only at a very high philosophical level. And actual writing down of policy by enactment should be the job of capable, competent, independent regulators.
Right.
And therefore, because all the devil is in the policy,
yes,
as we've seen in so many sectors. Once you have capable regulators who are respected, who command respect, who are competent, in a way, this band-aid of having a national IB, National Investment Board, sometimes is a remedy worse than the disease. In today's stretched times, it may be a necessity.
Right.
But this is not the way I would like our country to be run.
So these regulators are very important. I want to go across to Srivatsa in Bangalore. I know that you've got you're the only serving IAS officer we have on the panel, so you're from the government. I know you've got an opinion on keeping the ministries as they are. Why?
Raghav, I think we should be practical in the suggestions we are making, and I don't think it's feasible for any Prime Minister, even someone who comes with a 272 plus majority, to merge these 4 ministries together. Then we'll go back and say that they become so Byzantine that you need separate ministries for faster decision making. Look at any corporation in the world. Look at the largest corporations in the world. They have the biggest bureaucracies in the private sector or in the public sector. So you're not talking about just merging 4 ministries. You're talking about merging whole services below them, their organizational structures. That's simply not feasible nor desirable.
You're against
Having
it on
said that, I think
you're against it on logistical grounds. What about the sort of turf wars that we see? Coal doesn't talk to steel, doesn't talk to finance, doesn't talk to shipping.
I think merging them will be a disaster. They'll talk even less. It'll be an artificial envelope put over on top of all the existing cleavages which you don't want. What is desirable is what you mentioned in the first and second points.
Okay.
If you look at the last 12 months, the Cabinet Committee on Investments has about 400 projects worth 250 billion in front of it.
Right.
In the last 12 months, they have cleared projects worth 70 billion, or 1/3 of that, which is a great sign. And I think it's a partnership between the Prime Minister, the Cabinet and the Chief Ministers, which is the way ahead for infrastructure. Okay. So the idea of an empowered National Infrastructure Board is welcome. Okay. Or the Cabinet Committee on Investment could have the concerned Chief Minister as a special invitee, and they could take the decisions on these projects to move them forward. On regulation, the problem is not about separating reform, policy and regulation. The problem is we have regulators without backbones. Now, if you look at most power sector regulators in this country, in almost every state, they are regulators on paper. and they don't, most of them, with some honorable exceptions, do not have any backbones worth talking about. So unless you have the right kind of regulators, who are not rubber stamps of the government in the right positions, you're not going to see independent regulation taking off in this country.
Absolutely. We are talking about empowered regulators and professionals who who've got understanding and backbone. Shailesh.
I would believe that transport is one integrated unit and should have one good minister looking after it.
Yes.
Whether we can achieve it with a slightly weaker prime minister is questionable, but with a stronger prime minister, certainly. You know why? Mr. Khanduri was a highways minister who transformed Indian highways.
Right.
His successors were not as good. It's not only about the ministry, but about the minister you put in charge. So Madhavraj Scindia or Nitish Kumar were great railway ministers. And point number 1 and 2, I think the Prime Minister should just focus on what the government of India can do instead of bothering about state governments. So therefore, the National Infrastructure Board is a good idea, but perhaps the focus should be on reducing all these unnecessary regulations.
Okay, fine. I mean, we're saying the same thing, focus from the Prime Minister. Dheeraj.
I think on point number 3, the global practice is to have one, most countries have one unified Ministry of Transport, and this gels in with our other recommendations to actually downsize the number of cabinet ministers you have.
Right.
Now, each of these can obviously run as separate departments, but some of the stuff like railways, I think as long as you have the railway board, that we'll discuss it later, but as long as you have this unified monolith railway board, nothing's going to happen. So perhaps by merging ministries, what you also do is distract one minister from fiddling in everything. There's
the typical bit about turf.
Absolutely. And independent regulators, I think they work well in certain sectors, but obviously there's a problem if, for example, in telecom, if you appoint the retiring telecom secretary as the telecom regulator, there's a problem. So here also there'll be the same problem. If you make the retiring roads and highways secretary the road tariff regulator or the chairman of the railway board the rail regulator, there's a problem there. So we need to avoid that problem, of course, to make the suggestion work.
So here we are, Prime Minister, on point number 4, and this is something, again, this is a practical suggestion. We are saying that the golden quadrilateral program, which already has built a lot of 6-lane highways, we are saying try and convert them into 12 lanes. Now, this is a quick win because you won't run into land acquisition issues. You won't run into environmental delays. You've got a 6-lane highway, convert it into 12-lane, and this could kickstart a lot of activity. Vinayak?
There are 2 points of view on this. See, one is that you keep expanding the highway because you've got an alignment already. And there is a different point of view which says India needs greenfield, access controlled expressways. Like right now, the Delhi-Jaipur expressway is under discussion and it's expected to be a 30,000 crore project. So the country actually has to make a choice, not the entire length of the golden quadrilateral and north, south, east, west. That's the broad format we have. Not all stretches are amenable to, are not commercially viable to be made into straight into 12.
Not all, we are saying
but obviously, wherever there is traffic, it's a no-brainer that wherever traffic can take it, extend the number of lanes, but also think of access controlled greenfield expressways.
No, this is a quick win thing. This is certainly not the full solution. I want to quickly have a poll in the audience. How many of you would be in favor of converting these 6 lanes into 12 lanes as traffic is growing? Do you think that should be done? Please raise your hand. So yes, so we have almost a 50 to 60%, well, almost towards the end we got another 5%. So about 65-70% of the people supporting this. That's a quick win, Prime Minister. It's not something that we expect you to confine yourself to, but you can start with this and then get the road sector fully energized all over again. We'll take a quick break at this stage. You go to thinkindia.in.com, give your suggestions, and come right back after this very short break. Welcome back to Change India, an agenda for the next Prime Minister. Today we are focusing on infrastructure, how to get this thing which has been lying virtually dormant for a long time, how to really get it started. And we are on point number 5 and point number 6, and this is to do with public-private partnership. You've heard this acronym, PPP. It's been much reviled, but we believe that there is no other way other than to reform the PPP, but work within PPP, because a lot of India will have to be developed in this model, because our infrastructure needs at $1 trillion is almost a catchphrase. Along with that is point number 6, which is really you've got to now, we've talked about how financing can be opened up for PPP projects. We've said you've got to develop long-term bond markets, you've got to get pensions funds and private equity funds into this. Banks, commercial banks cannot provide all the financing that's needed for India's infrastructure needs. Vinayak, I know you've written extensively on this.
You know, the fundamental point about a PPP contract is that it envisages that the private sector promoter developer is able to predict traffic or footfalls or coal prices across a period of 30 or maybe even 60 years. In the case of Delhi, Mumbai airports, the contracts are 30 plus 30, 60 years. Now, that's a huge amount of economic prediction that even a seasoned economist can't do. So, lawyers call a PPP contract an incomplete contract under law.
Right.
So, the moment you accept the proposition that with best of intentions a PPP contract is an incomplete contract under law, then you, in parallel, if you agreed with that logic, then you need a system that enables transparent, credible renegotiation.
Yes.
So, therefore, it is imperative, we have been saying this for a long time to the Prime Minister, to the Planning Commission, to the PMO, that we certainly need a credible, transparent organization for PPP renegotiation. I fully endorse the point.
Right. Srivatsa, give us some practical inputs on how this can be set up and done, this design can be improved.
Well, I agree and disagree with Vinayak on what he just said. It is an incomplete contract, but it is so in every part of the world. How is it that developers and authorities in other parts of the world predict traffic with a large amount of accuracy? The problem is, in the unique Indian context, we have developers who try taking out every bit of equity before the first stone is laid, and then come back and say we want to renegotiate. They assume there will be a renegotiation built into the contract, so the level of trust between the government and the private developer is extremely limited. That's the first point. The second is, everything is not PPP-able. We must not go in believing that every piece of infrastructure can be done through the PPP mode. Metro rails around the world, there are about 140 metros. Other than 2 or 3 of them, everything else has been done by the sovereign, by the government, not by PPP.
I think, Srivatsa, we are digressing. We understand everything is not PPP. What is PPP-able? How is that got to be reformed? I think that's the point.
This whole belief that you're going to find $500 billion, the $1 trillion, 47% coming from the private sector, I don't think our capital markets currently have the depth, neither do retained earnings. Look at the balance sheets of corporates. They are today, even our best years, you have about $8 billion coming from IPOs for infrastructure sector and about $8 to $10 billion in retained earnings. That's 20 billion. Whereas your gap is another $10 to $15 billion year on year only on equity. So the big issue before doing PPP is absence of funding. Second is absence of bankable projects. Even if you do get the funding, there are not enough projects, which goes back to the issue of the model concession agreement. How did we do the Golden Quadrilateral? There was no model concession agreement then, but between 1999 and 2004, 12,000 kilometers of Golden Quadrilateral created without a model concession agreement.
You know, but you know, I'm hearing problems from you, so I need solutions. Mr. Aga.
Raghav, let me make 2 points. I want to agree with you that PPP, we have to reform it. It is not just finance that you require from the private sector. The original concept of PPP is to mimic the power of competition.
Right.
Into sectors which were considered incapable of competition. So that is the intellectual mindset which requires regulators very different from the kind of ministers we've had. It's an intellectual leap. That is point number 1. Point number 2, to take Vinayak's point, public-private partnership, there are also private-private partnerships. I have worked in corporations where we've had 20-year contracts.
Right.
Involving obviously nothing in the scale of a Golden Quadrilateral, but still large enough. Now a simple thing, that if you fix a price, we used to fix it that price is equal to AX plus BY plus CZ plus constant.
Right.
So you try and neutralize and anticipate many variables, and even then they operate within upper end, and in good faith you sometimes have to renegotiate. But that reduces, if you just have a price that $2.36, it is a recipe for disaster.
So therefore you have to have these flexibilities.
Absolutely.
Built
Number 2, renegotiation should be rare.
Right.
But when it comes to it, it should be done, and there should be give and take. You cannot, as Srivatsa is saying, get in under being L1, lowest one,
right,
throw out all the others,
right,
and then start getting gold-plated cost plus pricing.
Right.
We had NTP 99 15 years ago, which was a national requirement, which was statesmanship, but then we got a break in cash flow. Government lost nothing in the bargain, but they stripped the telecom companies of their duopoly.
Right. So Sailesh, let me get you in here. We've also said wherever projects are failing, then since government is involved here and since government money is involved here, you've got to have no other way but a transparent re-auction.
Actually, absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
Let me take a minute here.
Yeah.
You know, Vinayak and I have debated this over the last 5 years. if there is a PPP contract, all you have to do is, after the award, stop any renegotiation. And this is the global practice. We need to recalibrate our PPP model. And let me define it as caterpillars and butterflies. Give me a minute. You know, caterpillars are ugly to look at, but they turn into beautiful butterflies. From a finance perspective, infrastructure projects under construction are very ugly to look at. But when they start throwing up cash, they turn into butterflies. Now, the private sector is ideally suited to come in at the butterfly stage, right? When cash flow is visible. Hear me out. I'll give you 4 examples of highways in India.
Right.
One is the Bangalore-Mysore Expressway, one is the Yamuna Expressway, one is the Bombay-Pune Expressway, and one is the Kundli-Manesar-Palwal Expressway. Which of these is the most successful? The Bombay-Pune Expressway. And that is what happened in the Bombay-Pune Expressway. It was constructed using government money and contracts, and then given it out once it was throwing up cash.
No, fair enough. So, Dheeraj, we've heard. As we've seen, this is a lot of how it can be reformed going forward. We have a problem of a past mess to clean up as well. So, so sum it up for us. We've heard lots of points of view here.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one because, as you said, there's very little other option. I mean, there's maybe some projects which can be done by the public sector alone and some by the private sector alone, but a majority have to be in partnership. And now this has been a sector which has been accused of a lot of crony capitalism, a lot of manipulation of original deals, as Mr. Aga said, you bid L1.
Gold plating.
So there's a lot of problems, and I think a more forward-looking approach is very necessary. I think Shailesh has thrown a good idea that the capital expenditure should be incurred by the government and then get the private sector in to operate it. I think that's the thing. Government still has to lead with the finance where possible, and the private sector has to do the operation because they are better at that. And of course, the other point which we haven't given much time to, that's where we need to expand the horizon of raising finances.
Correct.
So that the private sector can also come in with finances. Right now, the private sector doesn't have enough options on financing.
Correct. So let me quickly, you've heard this debate. I just want a quick sense from the House. How many of you would be in favor of the past mess? I'm not talking about the ones going forward, but the past ones of re-auctioning the ones which have failed. Well, yeah, so the House clearly, by a small majority, seems to believe that re-auctioning at least cleans up the past mess. I want to move very quickly on to railways because this is another very big one that needs to be addressed. We've got points number 7 and 8. Our first one is just corporatize Indian railways, break them up into 4 or 5 regional autonomous units. China has done it very successfully. We are also saying list these companies so that there is shareholder pressure, there is competition. And then we've said induct private capital into running trains, into running stations. If all of this can be done in the aviation sector, then why not in the Indian railways? Of course, the corollary point is that you've got to have a very strong regulator and a professional regulator. Along with that, we are saying point number 8, which is to start building high-speed rail networks in India. We are saying make a beginning with the Shatabdi trains, convert them one by one into high-speed trains. And we've said start with a pilot project, start with Mumbai-Ahmedabad. It probably will be your, if that succeeds, then you can replicate that elsewhere. Shailesh.
I think this is the single biggest favor that the new Prime Minister can do to the country. The railways is one asset that is run very inefficiently. And we have lots of friends in the railways who are the best engineers in the country. Why should operations and maintenance of the railways be suboptimally managed? Number one. Number two, the railways can contribute to the entire productivity of the nation by just making sure that cargo moves off highways. So today the multimodal share of the railways is steadily declining for cargo. If the Prime Minister can make it, a 10% jump in the next 5 years, this country will change.
Would you agree with our suggestions?
Yes, absolutely. How do you do it? Number one, make the railways into a corporation and get rid of the railway budget on an annual exercise. Number two,
get rid of the railway ministry.
No, you'll need a ministry.
You need a Ministry of Transport.
Yeah, so you have an NHAI.
Yes.
You have an NHAI and you have a highways ministry. So you need some kind of ministry, but you definitely need to corporatize the railways. Number two, focus on high-speed rails.
Yes.
Now, just to give you an example, I fly Beijing, Shanghai in 2.5 hours. I do the train journey in high-speed rail in 4.5 hours.
Right.
Imagine doing that in Bombay and between Bombay and Delhi.
Vinayak.
The reform of the railways was suggested in great depth by the Rakesh Mohan Committee report of 2002.
10 years ago.
It is a 3-phase program. First, you have to reform the existing establishment. How do you reform it? Ministry of Railways only for policy by the elected representatives. The politicians view policy for the railways. And below it, an executive board consisting of non-railway people also, and as you rightly mentioned, in parallel, a very strong independent regulator.
Right.
This is stage one, reforming. Stage two, once this is set, is corporatization. And as you again rightly said, you can corporatize either geographically, that you can have a Northern Railway as a separate company, Southern, or you can corporatize by function, which is passenger, freight, and tracks.
Actually, China, I think, has done both.
Yeah. And then you can skin it both ways. The last, after this, if you have successfully done this, maybe after 1 or 2 decades, then you privatize this. So I'm going to stop now and say, this is the roadmap: reform, corporatize, privatize.
Okay, Srivatsa, you first, but please keep it quick and short.
I agree with what Vinayak said. Corporatization, if we could do it for VSNL, there's no reason why we can't do it successfully for the railways. We have a model which has worked, and the Rakesh Mohan committee has good recommendations which we should follow.
Mr. Aga?
Raghav, I completely agree with his point and his steps and the process. It's interesting, you know, the reason why railways is at all a separate budget is because once upon a time the railway budget was bigger in size than the union budget.
That's correct.
That was
the British times.
100 years ago. Railways started in 1854 and our mindset is still there.
And we still continue.
But I want to make, apart from these bullet trains and high-speed tracks, I want to make a small point.
Yes.
Look at freight. Export and import freight, the railway share is very high.
Yes.
Because it requires no management. You get a rake and you just take it.
Right.
The moment you have to make a little effort, which is inland freight, it is all shifted to the road transport.
Right.
Now this is a colossal national waste. It is a waste of imported fuel, ecology, roads and so on. If we get this thing moving, we will actually bring down inflation in the country.
Right, right. So Dheeraj, you know, railways is one of those things which again is very easy to write on a piece of paper because traditionally in the last 15 years, railways is one portfolio that some of the senior members of a coalition partner actually demand.
Yeah. And the problem is that the whole outlook on railways is as a source of patronage for constituencies, for particular states, for particular people. And that mindset really desperately needs to change, because if you're going to give away railways to a minister or to a party which is just going to use it, sort of milk it for their own, political, narrow political gains, that's not going to work. And this is one thing the Prime Minister can do, because railways is completely under the control of this one ministry and of the central government. There's no state government involvement at all, no conflicts. So this is one thing the Prime Minister can do. So start, if not the unified Ministry of Transport, appoint a railways minister, young, energetic, reformist mindset, who can do this, who will willing to cede his powers, who's willing to corporatize it, who's willing to think ahead, think big on bullet trains, fast trains. And we can't always say, look, it's too costly, we can't do it. I mean, China has done it, and it's remarkable the kind of benefits you can have. I mean, even in terms of urbanization, if you can have a fast-speed train between Delhi and cities within 250 kilometers,
that's right,
you'd have a huge growth of new urban centers and huge economic activity. So the gains are huge, the possibilities are huge, but you don't need a railway minister who's going to use it for narrow political gains.
And to build just for his particular state, because we've had only regional parties running railways.
And I think the old-fashioned style, you just increase the number, every budget you announce an increase in the number of trains.
Yes.
You won't do anything about fares.
Yes.
All that needs to change.
Okay, so let me quickly get a sense from the House, a poll. You got a question, sir?
Yeah, I would like to add on to what Mr. Vinayak Chatterjee was saying. Predominantly, in addition to that, what I was thinking, like the biggest problem that railway is facing right now is monopolization.
Right.
Why can't there be a substitute where regional or local level,
which is what we've talked about,
private developers or some state level agencies are being appointed to do? A Konkan Railway is the biggest success story in that.
Absolutely. Now, question. Do you think the Prime Minister, we all know what is to be done, but you know, in a lot of areas in India, we all know what is to be done. Question is, will the new Prime Minister, in your assessment, have the political will to do this? I think about 40% here seem to believe that he or she will be able to do it.
May have the will, but probably he will not have the complete support to do it.
That's what we are saying. That's what we are saying. So almost 60% don't seem to believe. But Mr. Prime Minister or Madam Prime Minister, this is going to be one of those few things that you'll have to do within your first couple of weeks in office, because if the Railways Ministry again goes to a regional chieftain who is going to use it for patronage purposes, then we know that a big battle would have been lost. So before we go into a break, we've got this audience here who have got all their suggestions. They've put them on a placard with the hashtag #TellTheNextPM, and all these suggestions that they're now going to show up for you, we will put together and give them to the next Prime Minister. I would also suggest that you should go to the hashtag #TellTheNextPM and give your suggestions. Welcome back to Change India, an agenda for the next Prime Minister. We've already done 8 points for the infrastructure sector. In the previous segment, we've gone through the very knotty areas of how to reform PPP and how to corporatize Indian Railways. 2 very big points. We're now down to points 9 and 10. I'll pick up point number 9, and this is for a long time in India, aviation has been looked upon as a luxury. We've got to change that mindset. It is a necessity in this country. We are saying make 50 new airports in big cities, tier 2 and tier 3 towns, abolish the aviation fuel tax, and try and get much more PPP or private sector participation in getting this done. Srivatsa.
Raghav, I agree completely with that. If you look around the world, the aviation fuel tax varies by geography. You can't have the same tax as you impose in, say, a Mumbai or a Bombay with something which you do in, say, a Mysore or a Mangalore. So once you bring in a variation in that, there will be an incentive for newer airports to come up. Having said that, we discussed slightly a few minutes ago about, post-PPP renegotiation. This has been a disaster when it has come to the airport privatization. Please take the case of Mumbai or Delhi, where you've got good airport, but at what cost? So I don't think, while privatization is certainly welcome, I think at the end of the day, the infrastructure is being created for the citizen, not for the private partner. And if you look at the costs at which these airports have been created, they are hugely expensive by any global benchmark. So indeed, privatization is welcome, but you need to ensure that it is done in a calibrated manner, not slip in charges because the financial capacity of the developer starts falling and you don't know who to go to get the remaining money, and you go to the citizen and say, we're going to now suddenly add a passenger tax by some name which was not there in the original contract, so that our developer who is making losses can suddenly make up and recoup his profits.
Vinayak?
2 quick points on 50 new airports. The idea is certainly very good. In fact, the Civil Aviation Ministry right now has 2 lists, 100 and 50, and the 50 is for immediate action. The routes have to be viable. So you have to use low-cost planes like, which are propeller-driven, etc. The biggest impediment, as you've rightly pointed out, is the sales tax, which is a state subject on ATF, aviation turbine fuel.
Right.
It is as high as 33% in many states, and across there should be one uniform. It should be declared an essential good and taxed at 4%. Some states have already taken a march. Assam, Bengal and Orissa, I think a few months ago, have raised, and Amit Mitra as Finance Minister of Bengal was at the forefront of reducing ATF in Bengal, and Assam and Orissa and a few others have followed suit. And the results are dramatic. For example, Indigo has increased the number of flights to Bagdogra. So it is imperative that these 50 get developed. 70% of the operating cost of an airline is fuel. And if you bring down ATF from as high of 33 to 4, you will make these 50 airports commercially viable.
Right. Mr. Aga, we've also talked about how you can make this ATF actually a bargaining chip in getting GST going.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is a linkage between ATS and ATF and GST, but I'm coming back to the more fundamental thing you mentioned, which is that this is really breaking a mold. There is a mindset that aviation is affluence, it is wasteful, whereas what you are saying, which is the correct, is it is infrastructure, which is an important tool. Once you start thinking that way, everything else becomes simpler. I want to suggest just one other mold which needs to be broken, that we should not spend money in a secular fashion for maximum effect. I have often wondered why Bihar, which can attract, if you just spend 500 crores of equity seed money, you can make it an epicenter of global Buddhist pilgrimage.
Yes.
And this
you don't even have a good airport there.
You don't have to come and ask for special status. Just leave it and Bihar will transform. But no one does of it, and they just want to come and ask the center for this dole and that dole.
And the number of chartered flights which come in with Japanese and other Buddhist tourists to Patna every day.
You would not be absolutely.
But look at the Patna airport. So Dheeraj, this one is a simple one, right? I mean, it is really a change of a taxation rate. I mean, put simplistically.
Yes, of course, and the reason, of course, a lot of it depends on the states. So some states have already done it, but we were suggesting include it in a grand bargain on the GST. So get rid of it altogether. That's one thing. But I think the other moot point is competition. I mean, for a budget airline model to work, and that's the way it works in other parts of the world, you need to have many more airports, especially airports which offer cheaper landing fees. Right now, Delhi has one. So why not? Delhi should have 2, Mumbai should have 2. There should be multiple airports, there should be competition so that budget airlines can fly to cheaper airports. And that's the only way civil aviation is going to become accessible to the ordinary person. And it won't be a matter of affluence anymore.
Absolutely. So I just want to do a quick audience poll here. How many of you believe that the government of India still thinks of aviation as a luxury sector? Well, this is a screaming sort of instruction for the next Prime Minister or instructive thing for the Prime Minister, that you've got to change this mindset. Aviation is not luxury. People need to travel for work, for other things. I've come to now the final point. And this one, again, sounds very simple. You also have a great demonstration project here. We are saying privatize major public sector ports. If airports can be private, if we are talking about privatization or corporatization of railways, why do ports need to be in public sector hands? And we also have the example of Mundra, which is India's most efficient port, which is in the private sector. So we've said begin this and at least pick up 2 ports, which can be put on fast track privatization. Vinayak.
Good point. I think you're making this point in the background of a very significant shift of cargo from the 12 ports owned by the center, which are called the major ports, into the clutch of what are today called, they're not minor ports, but private sector ports. Yes, so you've seen a dramatic shift into private sector. The important point about state-owned ports is that they have an archaic governance structure which is governed by trusts. They are governed by the port trusts.
That's right.
Now, before you privatize it, just like the railways, you have to disband these trusts, first corporatize these ports, and then either privatize the port in totality or privatize elements of the port, like specific berths.
Handling.
And so this is task which has to be certainly done. The other is that the ports are governed, the tariff is the key issue, and they're governed by, again, a governance structure called TAMP, Tariff Authority for Major Ports, which has outlived its utility. So you certainly need in parallel to create, to just junk TAMP. Today the government tinkers at the edges and have an independent port regulatory authority.
So we are seeing it's the same problem repeating itself in sector after sector after sector. Corporatize it, change it into a modern
and an independent regulator.
Get an independent regulator.
Railways, ports.
And induct private capital. I mean, it's the same formula which is working. Srivatsa, last comments from you.
In ports, the example which tells the story very well is the world's largest container PSA, and what has been happening in the Tuticorin port from 1999. They've not been allowed a single tariff revision. They've been operating for 14 years. You have a regulator who is actually slashing tariffs and not allowing them to increase tariffs, which prevents them from bringing in new investment. And they've gone to court, they've got stays. But the point is, after you sign a contract, if through a policy mechanism you change critical clauses of that contract, it's simply not going to work. I agree completely with Vinayak that you need to do away with the TAP. Look at Gujarat. How did Gujarat have a completely port-led development model? 43 private ports have come up in the last 15 years within the existing framework. And if one state can do it, why can't the others?
Okay, so quick comments, concluding comments, Mr. Aga, and then Shailesh.
Just think of it. This is what Srivatsa and Vinayak have said, and I'm sure Shailesh and Dheeraj will also say the same thing. Not just this brings in efficiency, this is an important anti-inflationary, and so are all our other suggestions.
That's right.
And if we keep expecting Dr. Raghuram Rajan to bring down prices, it's not going to happen. It has to come through working.
Yes. Good point. Shailesh, we've almost been a parrot through this show. It's the same thing that needed to be done.
So let me offer a different perspective.
Yes.
The Prime Minister will find this an easy win, but not at all 12 ports, because in many ways the mafia in the ports is the strongest.
Right.
Right? So let's just identify 2 easy wins among the 12, corporatize them, not try to do all 12.
That's what we've said. That's what we said. Start with 2. Yeah. Get the demonstration impact going, and then things will happen. Dheeraj, final words.
Again, this is something which the 12 major ports come under the centre's control, so there's no excuses here. It needs some hard work, some hard digging, but a start has to be made, which is why we said don't do 12, do 2. Make a modest start. But I mean, Mr. Aga is right. This has huge consequences for the economy. Infrastructure does have huge, we don't realize it. We look at it in isolation, but it has huge consequences for everything else, whether it's inflation, whether it's growth. So I think the need for an independent regulator, the need for private capital, the need for corporatization is a must across all the sectors that we've discussed today.
Okay, so we've come up with a little formula, a simple formula, which says most of these projects need modern corporate structures. They need independent regulators, and then they need induction of private capital. Frankly, there are just 3 things that need to be done across different infrastructure segments. Would you agree? Yes, 100%. I think we won the day. We won the day. Yeah. Mr. Prime Minister or Madam Prime Minister, these are 10 points. We'll come across and give them to you. But as we've just demonstrated, there are 3 or 4 simple things that need to be done. They're simple, they're difficult, but they need to be done. Before we go, take a look at all our 10 points.